You said Phil's podcast has 500 five-star reviews. That is less persuasive than if you said Phil's podcast has 492 five-star reviews. 492 is less than 500, but because 500 is a rounded general number, it's less believable because it's more likely to have been made up. We make a quick judgment. We think, well, 500, that doesn't sound right.
Hello and welcome to Resonate, your backstage pass to how successful entrepreneurs, coaches, and consultants harness the power of storytelling, create authentic personal brands, and scale their businesses with smart systems. Today, I am so excited to be welcoming our guest, Phil Agnew, who is the brilliant mind behind Nudge. So Nudge is the UK's #1 marketing podcast. He has over 500,000 listeners and nearly 500 five-star reviews. But more than that, something that I particularly love about Phil, and I think you will see that in evidence with the discussion we have, is that he makes consumer psychology, behavioral economics, all these things much more simple and actionable, which I think is particularly fitting for this time of the year when we all try to make big changes in our lives. And Phil has this message, which is it's the small changes that make a big impact. So I am very excited to be having you on this podcast, Phil. Thank you for being here.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, and thank you for that really lovely intro. Appreciate it.
All sincere. I genuinely mean it. I think I'm one of these typical people who tries to do all the things and keep changing and growing and realizing that consistency over intensity is the way to do it. So on that note, I want to really focus on these 3 proven psychology principles that you're going to be sharing with us to improve our marketing and boost sales in our businesses. So where I want to start is perhaps a few examples actually of how there could be simple principles that lead people to take better action.
Yes. So the idea that simple things can drive action is sometimes a bit controversial, because I think we should look out for people who say, oh, do this tiny change and you will 3x your revenue. We've probably all been bitten in the past by claims of that nature. But that doesn't mean that we should throw aside more reliable evidence, which comes from the world of science and behavioral science and psychology in particular, which has been proven to show that some small changes really can make a difference. And the reason why this is kind of, well, simple. Our brains have to make thousands of decisions a day. There is some ridiculous numbers about how many decisions we have to make. Some people say it's up to 50,000. God knows who counted all of those, but we have to make a lot of decisions. And Daniel Kahneman, in his book Thinking Fast and Slow, he's the Nobel laureate, he talked about how our brains use 2 modes of thinking when we make decisions. Now, this isn't literally what happens in your brain. It's much more complex than that. We don't really understand what happens in the brain. But these 2 systems are good analogies for what the brain is doing. So there is system 1, and this is the very fast, automatic, shortcut, loves to take the easy route way of deciding things. So this is, you are driving your car. You are never, when you're an experienced driver, you were just not really thinking about how you were putting your foot on the pedal, how you are lowering your foot on the clutch, how you're moving between gears. It all happens automatically. That's what system 1 is. And we make 90% of our decisions using that mode of thinking. The second way of thinking is system 2, and that is a lot more thoughtful, a lot more rational, a lot more energy goes into it. If you're deciding whether or not to buy a house or whether or not to take a job, you'll engage the system 2 mode of thinking. Now, when we think about small things you can do to change someone's decision, it'll be hard to do one small thing to change someone's system 2 decision making. It'll be hard for me to just bake a loaf of bread, put it in my house and have people tour my house, and that be the sole reason why people then buy my house. No, it's hard to influence system 2 decisions, but to influence system 1 decisions, it can actually be quite easy. So that could be as small as adding a couple of extra stamps on somebody's loyalty card when they go for a coffee, And that might just encourage them to keep coming back and build a bit of a habit with your loyalty card. It might be something like adding a bit of distinctiveness to the letter that you send to someone to encourage them to open it. It might be something like showcasing your effort. And we can get into all of these biases, but to influence decisions with seemingly small interventions, you're really going to be influencing those automatic system one decisions that people make.
Thank you for explaining that. I find it quite surprising, actually, because I think my non-expert view or opinion on this would have been that what you're saying here with these two systems, one is quite subconscious. It's our automatic behaviors, it's our habits. And I would have assumed that they would have been more deeply ingrained and therefore harder to change than the ones which involve that conscious present moment thinking.
I think what you've said is accurate, and it's true. They are deeply ingrained. And let's take, for example, the idea of scarcity. We are deeply wired to want scarce things. And this comes from 10,000 years worth of history. When we were hunter-gatherers and we would collect a very rare type of berry, for example, which might be very nutritious. Actually, fruit is a better example. Let's say it's mango season and we've got the option to have a lot of mangoes. We know that resource is scarce because we don't have it very often, and our brain tells us to consume and hoard as much of that resource as possible. That makes sense in a world where so many things are scarce. That was necessary for our survival. But it takes millennia for our brains to evolve, and the world has changed dramatically since those hunter-gatherer days. So today, when we see, for example, a limited offer, there's a little part of our brain which is thinking the same thing we saw when we saw those mangoes 10,000 years ago, which is, I need this, I should grab it. A great example of this comes from Robert Cialdini's book, Influence, where he talks about the Concorde. The day before the Concorde announced it would stop flying in 2 years' time, sales were as normal. People were just buying a normal amount of Concorde tickets. This is the supersonic jet that flew between London and New York. The day they announced it would stop flying in 2 years' time, so it's still a lot of time to buy a ticket, sales for the remaining seats on the flights that were upcoming sold out almost immediately. Anybody who's tried to get Glastonbury tickets, anybody who tried to get Oasis tickets over summer, if you're in Britain, understands the scarcity feeling. We value scarce resources, and this is not because this is something that is just modern within our brains. It is because of a really quite ancient shortcut that we used to make decisions back in our hunter-gatherer days.
Mm-hmm. I guess it goes without saying, but would scarcity be one of your principles that you think we should all think about now that you're explaining that?
Well, no, I'm not going to include that one. I mean, really, Shannon, there's like 100 different behavioral science principles that you can apply. There is no best one. There are different reasons as to why you might apply one to a different setting. The three I'll talk about today, I won't include scarcity because I'll give a couple more examples, but they're ones that seem to be a bit more general, seem to apply to a few more things. So I'll kick off with the first one, which is distinctiveness. This is, I think, really important for marketers. We know that there's a real need to be able to stand out as marketers. But what distinctiveness tells us is that being distinct is different from just being different. It's a bit of a mouthful, but that's what we mean. And to understand the science behind it, we have to go back to 1933 and understand the research created by a female researcher called von Restorff. And she was a real pioneer in her time. What she got people to do was to read long lists of letters and try and remember as many combinations of the letters as possible. Very different to do. X, W, Z, Y, B, C, all of these different combinations. It's very hard to remember that. Our brains aren't really wired to remember things in that way. But what she would include in that long list of letters to remember, different combinations, is a small list of numbers, one list of numbers. And it turns out people are 3 times more likely to remember the numbers than they are the letters. Now, you might be thinking, well, Phil, that's just because people can remember numbers. No, she flipped it. She made numbers the main thing that people had to remember, dozens of different combinations of numbers, and then one combination of letters. Suddenly the letters are 3 times more memorable. So what this is suggesting is that things that are distinct within their category tend to stand out. Richard Shotton, in his 2018 book, The Illusion of Choice, this was The Choice Factory. The Illusion of Choice is his latest book. Anyway, in The Choice Factory, he showed consumers different brands from a single category. So lots of different fast food brands, for example, KFC, McDonald's, Burger King. And then he included one brand from a different category, an automotive brand, Ford, for example. He found, just the same as von Westeros found almost 100 years ago, people were 3 times more likely to remember the distinct brand. He flipped it. He made the automotive brands, the common ones, and the fast food brands, the unique one within the group, they remember the unique one. So what all of this shows is that when you're thinking about standing out, you can't just think about being different. Being different, doing something different, isn't really what's important. What you should be doing, if you're a coach or you're a marketer or whatever you might be selling, is look at your peers, see how they advertise, see where they advertise, see the messaging they use, see the brand and the colors they use. And you should be thinking, I need to find an angle which is slightly different from that. One of the best examples of this actually comes from a heavy metal band. So heavy metal bands, as we well know, hardcore, you can really picture a heavy metal logo. It'll be gothic, it'll be black and white, it'll be metallic, it'll be quite sharp edges, all of these things.
Yeah.
And so when you look at a poster for a heavy metal festival, you see all of these logos for these heavy metal brands. They all look identical. There's one heavy metal band who plays the same music. It's called Party Cannon. And they just have a completely distinctive logo. It's multicolored. It's all light and bubbly, like a child's birthday party. And it stands out whenever they're performing a gig at a venue with other bands. And that is an idea of being distinct within your space. That branding wouldn't work if they were selling a soft play center to kids, but it does work. It does help them become more memorable within their space. And that's something I think all of us marketers should really consider.
So just to summarize, what I'm hearing from you is this general principle that we should focus not on being distinct, but on having distinctiveness, you say.
Yeah.
I'm not super clear on what the difference is. Can you break down for anyone who maybe has a question mark? What does distinct actually mean and what is distinctiveness?
So being different.
It's different.
Let me explain the whole thing.
All right.
So if you and I wanted to create a different podcast, like a totally different podcast, we might, I don't know, just do something completely random. We might decide to do all of this in poem form and just do a long rhyme. It wouldn't be very good. What being distinct is encouraging you to do is for us to look at other podcasters within our space who are creating similar episodes to this and find a way to make it slightly distinct compared to them. So it's looking within your space, seeing what the common theme is and coming up with something different. A good example would be football advertising. So soccer advertising, for those of you outside the UK. Almost every advertiser for a soccer football club or for a TV show is gambling, is beer, and there's probably a couple more brands, automotive. That means if you're an automotive brand or a gambling brand or a beer brand, there's really not much point advertising towards these football games because it's saturated. What you should be doing instead, if you really want to be distinct, so you're a new up and coming brand, you want to stand out in people's mind, is advertise somewhere totally different. Find somewhere where your competitors are not, because if you are distinct, you'll stand out. That's the basic meaning here. It's not just about, often when people think about wanting to stand out, they just think, oh, let's do something viral and different. Let's do the T-Mobile flash dance. That'll be different. That's not really a useful framework. We should be thinking, what are our competitors doing? What are all of the things they seem to share? What can we do that's different to stand out? Monzo as a bank was incredibly successful, not because it's done something totally different in the world of banking. They still do classic banking. They still let you transfer money and make savings, but they had an approach that was very different from the traditional banks, mainly online, mainly app-based, good customer service, a distinctive, different-looking card. All of those things help them stand out compared to their peers.
So if we were to apply this to, let's say, people listening who have an interest in creating a personal brand, whether they have a company that's separate or not, they want to build their personal brand. To put this idea into practice, what are some of the areas they should be thinking about as a possible point of difference? Would it be their messaging? Would it be their visual identity of their website and on their logos? Would it be how they do their marketing campaigns? What would you suggest to have as the categories to consider?
What I would suggest these individuals do is they create a list of all of the peers within their space, all of the people they admire, and find what are the common themes that people tend to be doing. Maybe they're all doing carousels on LinkedIn. Maybe they all use the same font on TikTok or the same type of music. Maybe they all film their personal videos the same way. What you should be thinking is, how can I take what's good? A lot of the time you'll have to copy. Maybe the themes that they talk about, maybe they all talk about burnout at work, and that tends to be something that resonates really well with the audience. That might be a worthwhile thing to copy. But if I just talk about burnout at work and I follow the same sort of style and format that the peers follow, I'll never be distinct. I'll never stand out. So instead, what I should do is I should take that theme and try and come up with a totally different way of doing that storytelling. Now, I'm not going to come up with a good idea on the spot about how you can do that, but that's the first part of it. All too often, we think things are easier than they are because we look at our peers within the field and we say, well, they're doing this. They're talking about burnout in front of a camera with a nice soft lighting behind them.
Therefore, it should work.
Therefore, it should work. But actually, the psychology says the opposite. Because it works for them, they've got their distinctiveness in the space already. If you try and copy that, you'll lose your chance to stand out and actually capture attention.
You know, the example that does come to mind for me in this space actually is a founder, an entrepreneur of Founder OS. His name is Matt Gray. He has a big following online. He helps entrepreneurs to improve their operating systems and their systems in general. Now, he, as an example of his content on LinkedIn, he speaks about these themes. So he'll mention burnout, he'll mention ADHD, he'll mention how to be more productive with your certain organization of to-do lists and so forth. But something he does different is that he gets an A4 sheet of paper and writes everything on it. It will just be one A4 sheet with all of the concepts, the principles, I think in black, with his color is, I think, lime green that you associate with him. And I remember thinking, wow, that stands out in and amongst this LinkedIn content because of that very reason. And I thought, that must take a while to make that, actually, when you think of handwriting. And I thought, actually, maybe the effort that goes behind doing that, the intentionality of creating content that will take you more time and to stick to that as a form of consistency has become a part of his brand and could therefore be an illustration of this principle that you're saying, be distinct. Or have distinctiveness.
And to add to that, he's not the first. Now, some people might be listening saying, well, he's not the first person to do that. You'd be right. There's a YouTube account called Numberphile, which explains maths. They traditionally have used a long piece of brown paper, felt tip pen to really ask mathematicians to work through maths problems, film it, really, really nicely done. So similar theme. What this person has done is applied that concept to a field where it's not currently used. So the classic example of distinctiveness within the advertising space is the company called comparethemarket.com. Now, this is a company that helps you find different car insurance, for example.
Is that the one that has the meerkats?
Well, it is now, Shannon, and you know, because they stood out. But the story pre-meerkat is very interesting. So this company really struggled when it first set up. All of its ads were based on the sort of classic things a marketer would suggest: the speed in which the website would search the brands, what types of deals you would get, basically the features and the benefits, the classic things that we would advertise. And the problem was, everybody in the space did that type of advertising. So they couldn't be distinct by following that mantra of just showcasing how their brand is different and better from the rest. So, like you know, they invented a meerkat, and this meerkat comedically talked about the problem he had with his site, which was called comparethemeerkat.com, and the fact that he was losing SEO to comparethemarket.com. Is crazy.
With a Russian accent, I believe, or something like that.
Yeah. There is no textbook that would ever say that this would work unless you understand the von Restorff principle, unless you understand that what they have done is they have looked at the competitors within their space and they've said, if we don't come up with something different from these people, we will never stand out, we will never get market share. So they did. They came up with something different. It was incredibly successful. They hit their 12-month targets within 3 months, I believe. They became, I think, number 2 or if not number 1 market share. And they have since remained up there and since kept this ad for over a decade. But the most interesting thing, and this is the thing that marketers and all of your listeners need to be aware of, is what happened after they created that ad. All of the competitors within their space also decided to create
Oh no,
really distinctive
a
ads. So you've got,
mascot.
yeah, you've got moneysupermarket.com, which pictures builders doing breakdancing. You've got confused.com doing something really similar. You've got another one with an opera singing car salesman in it. It's like everybody went wacky, but they've totally missed the point. The point was not that being wacky and funny in your ads allows you to sell more car insurance. The point was that being distinct within your space actually works. Advertisements that stuck with what their original premise was probably would have done better. And I think that's the point we need to remember as marketers.
Got it. Let's go to the second principle, Phil.
Yeah. So, well, as I said, there's lots we could talk about. One that I wanted to talk about today was anchoring, mainly because most of your listeners will have heard of anchoring, but I think it's an important one to clarify and maybe share some sort of evidence behind it. So anchoring is this idea that we are heavily influenced by the initial piece of information you see. So if you go into a restaurant and you look at the menu, and the first item on the menu is $100 Philly cheesesteak. It's a crazy price for a Philly cheesesteak. You'll probably think that's ridiculous. I'll never buy that. But what it will do is it'll make the remaining items on the menu look fairly cheap in comparison because you were anchored by that initial high price point. If instead you went into a fancy wine bar, for example, and you looked at the menu, and the first item on the menu was a $2 bottle of or glass of white wine, which was a special on the menu, incredibly cheap because it was going out, suddenly everything else on the menu, the $20 glass of wine, will suddenly look very expensive. So there's lots of studies that showcase the power of anchoring. There was one really interesting one with newspaper headlines. So what the researchers did is they took newspaper headlines around sort of slightly political things like climate change bill to cost $1 million, for example. And then they changed the anchor. They changed the actual newspaper who published that story. Now, the story was made up. None of this actually happened, but they wanted to see if different anchors would change people's perceptions. Turns out when you put an anchor like the Financial Times, which is a very reputable news brand, as the author of a piece which said, or a news article that says climate bill to cost 100 million, people view it as a good idea, as well cited, as a well written article. And yet when you simply just changed the author from Financial Times to a tabloid newspaper like The Sun, people's perceptions of that identical article changed completely. Suddenly they thought it was perhaps badly sourced, or they thought climate change bill like that was a bad idea. So it's a really easy example of how changing the anchor can change it. But there are really simple ways you can apply this, because obviously that's not too relevant for the listeners. One that is more relevant is an example from Steve Martin's book, Messengers. Fantastic example. Steve Martin is he works a lot with Robert Cialdini, one of these sort of experts in persuasion. And he worked with a real estate agent in the UK. And all he did with this real estate agent was spent a bit of time looking at the initial thing that the potential buyers would hear or see when they interacted with the real estate agent. So it turns out what typically happened is people would call up the real estate agent, say, hey, I'm looking to have a viewing at this property or buy this property or make an offer on this property. And a receptionist would pick up the phone and they would say, oh, thanks so much. Let me just hand you over. That's all they would do. Steve thought, well, there's an opportunity there to add some anchoring, to change that initial message, and it might just change how the entire experience is perceived. So what he told the receptionists to do was to answer the phone, and rather than just saying, no problem, let me hand you over, instead, Steve encouraged them to say, so glad you called us. Let me hand you over to Jessica. She has 20 years of experience within the real estate space, and I think she'll be perfect for you. So just a slight anchor, slight thing. It was literally all they said was, let me hand you over to X person, and here's how many years experience they had. So just a slight different bit of information. And Steve says in his book that one line increased the number of evaluations they got by 20%, increased the number of sales they got by 20%. They did a control group where they compared the sales before and after. Just adding that one line changed people's perception of the whole estate agent. And it can really work, this stuff.
Out of curiosity, do you think that was more effective because it also came from another person rather than you introducing yourself saying, hi, I'm Shannon Jenkins. I have 20 years of experience in real estate, etc.?
Yeah, we know it, don't we? We don't like to brag. And when we hear other people bragging, we feel this immediate reaction, a reactance is what it's called, where we think, oh, okay, if you're bragging, you must be trying to sell me something. You know, we've all had that feeling of somebody trying to sell you something and you just wanting to sort of get away as quickly as possible. But yeah, if you can sort of find an interesting way to weave something like that into the conversation with somebody else telling you, somebody who maybe doesn't even have authority, but is just a different individual, that will be a bit more persuasive.
Mm-hmm. To put this into practice, what it is making me think of right now is the effort that people put into the header section on their website. So for one, the header section being the main image that people see when they go onto a website, and it will often, or at least from what I have heard, we should include things like a clear statement, a clear value statement about who you are and what you do. And you will often see a sort of banner of credibility, which is that association. So going back to the example you lifted with the Financial Times, if I had a logo of Financial Times, then Forbes, then Success Magazine, then whoever else, would that then give people that initial good impression or anchor me and my services to a higher value, a premium, a higher price point?
Yeah, I think the takeaway here is that people will view your website not with totally rational minds. They will be using their system one. They'll be making very quick decisions. So if you were selling coaching or some sort of personal branding, whatever it might be, the initial thing they see will heavily influence how they view the rest of your site. So you should, first of all, what that says is you should be spending a lot more time tweaking and working on whatever is above the fold. I'm not going to be able to give you very good examples as to what to put up there because it will be different based on your business, but it certainly shouldn't be something that you've spent the least amount of time working on. It should be the thing that you've spent the most amount of time working on because that will heavily change what you're trying to achieve. But say you are trying to achieve, for example, let's say you're a solicitor, and the main thing you want your readers, your visitors to take away is that you are trustworthy, is that you won't waste their money, is that you're cost efficient. So getting within the top of that fold, examples, evidence of those things can be very good. Having your credentials, having customer reviews, having perhaps cited by this local newspaper as being reliable, won this business award. Having that as early as possible is better because even if you have all of that information on your site, but you include it later on, people will perceive your site differently because they are more influenced by the initial piece of information. If the initial piece of information says your trusty, friendly solicitor and doesn't mention those things, but goes on to mention it later, people will not perceive you as trustworthy or as credible as you would be viewed otherwise because you haven't used that in your anchor.
And to go back to what you said earlier about us having a preference for numbers rather than letters, could one argue that it's more persuasive or influential to have those numbers in those header sections? So, for example, I'm helping right now as a couples therapist, and they have got 40 years of experience as couples therapists. They've helped over 15,000 couples. Would there be a bias towards having those numbers?
Well, what numbers do? There isn't per se a preference over numbers over letters in general, but what numbers do is they can showcase real effort and evidence. So if you can use data, you can showcase your work. And we're getting into another bias here, which is input bias and labor illusion. But if you can say, like, for example, there's a very good website that I like, which sells indoor houseplants. And as soon as you go to the site, one of the first things you will see is 250,000 reviews by trusted houseplant buyers, over 500 different types of plants, the UK's number one provider, and then I think something like delivered within 1 to 2 days. Now, you could say all of those same things without numbers. You could say loved by thousands. That would be the same as the review. You could say delivered within a week. That would be something else. And you could say, I've forgotten what the middle one was.
Or even, could it even be
like
delivered in 7 days, but written not with the number, but with the 7, S-E-V-E-N.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But what the numbers do is, first of all, they help our system on brain quickly process the information, and they quickly help showcase that there's actual evidence here. There's actual evidence. If you say, so there's something called a specific number bias as well, which is the idea that if I tell you my podcast. You at the start of this description, you said Phil's podcast has 500 5-star reviews. That is less persuasive than if you said Phil's podcast has 492 5-star reviews. 492 is less than 500, but because 500 is a rounded general number, it's less believable because it's more likely to have been made up. We make a quick judgment. We think, well, 500, that doesn't sound right. This is also why somebody who is ranked on a 5-point scale, if they have 5 stars, they will be less persuasive. They will be less willing. People will be less willing to pick the example. The study, was conducted with a tent provider, someone selling tents online. They put tents up there which had 500 5-star reviews, and the same tent, but which had, I think, 4.75 star review. The 4.75 star reviews were more likely to be purchased because people believe it more. So being specific and giving specific numbers helps better. And the same could be true for that delivery as well. Let's say this website could be improved because rather than saying delivered within 1 to 2 days, if you said most deliveries come within 49 hours, being very specific will actually make that claim more believable. And even though you're saying it will take a bit longer than 1 to 2 days, your claim will be more believable and people will be more persuaded by it. So numbers can help in that way.
Fascinating. So we're going to come to an example of a cold call or as a cold email, let's say, to a lead. This is going to be my example of an email that I sent to put myself forward as a moderator and a speaker for Europe's biggest business and leadership conference. But before we do that, I want to come to the third and final principle that Phil has to share with us today. So number 1, we have distinctiveness, second being anchoring, and the third is...
The third, let's go for one that I think is especially useful if you're working with individuals, if you're selling one-on-one, which I think many of your audience might be, trying to build connections. The most important principle, I think, within the world of behavioral science is reciprocity. This is one of Cialdini's 6 principles of influence, probably one of the most well cited, and it's extremely simple. It's what we were all taught as children. It's this idea that if we receive something from somebody, we have to give them something back. And it is incredibly powerful. There's dozens and dozens of studies which showcase the power of reciprocity. A very famous one with Dennis Reagan, in which people in an experiment who were given a free can of Diet Coke by supposedly a friendly research assistant, but was actually somebody who was totally in on the experiment. They donated 2 times as much to charity on the way out. But my favorite example is Philip Kuhn's example. He sent 600 Christmas cards to random people, complete strangers, just saying, hello, Merry Christmas.
How do you even get the addresses of those 600?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's a bigger question. Anyway, GDPR non-compliant. This was back in the 70s. Sent these 600 Christmas cards to total strangers. Rationally, nobody should reply. They don't know this person. They don't know who he is. He received 200 replies. And that is simply showcasing that people feel this reciprocity. People feel a need to return a favor once they've received something. And there's all sorts of ways that you can apply this as an individual. So, for example, one of the things I did is I made my course. I made a free course for my customer base. And I said it was called the Science of Persuasion course. Spoke about how much effort I put into it, all of that. Gave it away to my customers at no charge. I then followed up with them, those who had signed up, who had received this gift from me. And I followed up with them and I said, could you do me a really big favor? Could you leave me a review on Apple Podcasts? The number of people who left me a review after receiving something from me was astronomically, I don't have the data in front of me, but astronomically higher than those who were simply just asked to leave me a review. If you do something for somebody, they feel inclined to return the favor. It's very, very useful. If you want to build connections, I think especially on like LinkedIn, for example, on whatever social platform you're trying to grow on, give before you ask. So if you want somebody to start sharing your content, the best thing you can do is offer to do something for them originally. And what's kind of funny for me now, Shannon, is like my audience, I banged on about this for so long that my audience now know about it, and they'll email me. I get this quite a lot now, where somebody will just offer to do something random and really nice. Somebody will be like, can I promote you on my newsletter, or can I send you a book? And I'm like, I respond and I'm like, yes, but I know what you're doing. And I know You're going to ask me for something in a few days, and I'll have to say yes because I feel this reciprocity. And yet I still do because it really does work.
Yeah. And, it makes me think actually of, aside from all things business, marketing, sales, it is a genuinely nice way to live your life when you can approach things from that act of kindness or that act of service without crucially expecting something in return. I mean, I know this from having a 7-year-old son who I'm pretty sure would be like a master manipulator, like many child, knowing, oh, if I do this to mom first, if I give her a big smile and a hug and a kiss, she's going to then give me that later. And I think the key to the learning is, how do you give also freely without expecting something in return? But perhaps that's another question. What I'm hearing from this is the key to offering something first, because of course it's not the other way around. It's like you having to take that intentional action to be a service, to offer something to somebody else.
Yeah, it has to be that way around. It has to be you've offered something, you've given something, and you've given them with no strings attached. You can't be saying, here's this can of Coke, and by the way, I'll give it to you if you donate more to charity. In that Dennis Reagan study I talked about earlier, it has to be given totally freely, accepted or denied totally freely. And then later, at a follow-up point, you then have to ask for something in return. That's the key part about the reciprocity principle. But again, I think I want to just reiterate your point, because I think people can get really hung up on this being a manipulation tactic or scientific. This is not. This is just an intelligent way to act and live your life. If you go through your life doing good deeds for other people, there is a sort of scientific karma that will eventually pay back. So you will get paid back for this sort of thing in general. So the takeaway here is not to go around and find people that you want to sort of get on their good books and try and use this principle to sort of manipulate them. It's to treat everybody like this, because if you do, you will reap the rewards at some point.
Beautiful. All right, let's come over to this cold message. So what I propose is that I read this out. And for anyone who is listening and hasn't already subscribed to Resonate, the newsletter, you'll find a link in the episode description. And I will be breaking this down with all of the information that Phil is about to give us now. But let me read out this email. So like I said, this is me putting myself forward to somebody I have not met before. It is a big business and leadership conference, and I would like to be the moderator for that later on this year. So here is what I say. Hello, Phil. John gave me your email, and I believe mentioned to you that I would be emailing around the possibility of being part of the Nordic Business Forum next year. My name is Shannon Jenkins. I am the founder of Resonate, a company and Top 5% podcast dedicated to speaking and storytelling training. I speak on the power of storytelling in business and human connection, having worked with many Fortune 500 companies, including Nestle, Nespresso, and Google. I also host and moderate at big events globally, such as Startup Nights, Switzerland's largest startup event with over 9,000 visitors. I'd love to discuss the possibility of being involved at NBF next year, particularly as a moderator. Here is my 1.5 minute speaking and moderation reel. If you'd like, I had to specify 1.5 minutes. You crucify me if you want. I don't know. My 1.5 minute speaking and moderation reel, if you'd like to take a quick look. Plus, I've attached my speaker one sheet. Looking forward to hearing from you. Warmly, Shannon. P.S. I don't know why I felt the need to do this. P.S. I'm an English native speaker, Australian and British, and I live in Switzerland. There we go. Voila.
I like it. I like it.
All right, let's apply some of these principles. I am listening.
So, well, can I say what I really liked to begin with?
Yeah, that would be nice. Thanks.
The intro is really good. So that idea of, John gave, I mean, a lot of people do know this one. I was put in touch with you by mutual contact X. That is sort of implying a bit of reciprocity of, somebody I know has linked me up with this person. I should feel the need to actually respond to them, because otherwise John, this mutual contact, will feel bad and I'll have to explain to him why I didn't sync them up. So that's a really good opening. And I think that trumps most of the cold openings that you could possibly come up with. So I really liked that. You used quite a bit of specificity in there, which I think we've spoken about at the start, which we really liked. So saying 1.5 minutes I think you said 9,000 speakers at the Swedish Startup Nights, top 5% podcast. I wondered with the top 5% podcast if you could just be a bit more specific, because I think
Okay.
5% is slightly rounded. Even just saying top 6% podcast would probably make that more believable, even though it's less. And then I also wonder how you can sort of prove these things. So definitely including links in that emails. I'm sure you already do. But
I do,
hyperlinks.
yeah. The two hyperlinks I've included in that is one, the top 5%, which links to stats, and a link to an unlisted YouTube video for the moderation reel.
Yeah, that's really nice. I think the main thing I would actually ask you to improve is probably the PS. So we've spoken already about how the first piece of information you see is really important. There's a second bias called the peak end rule, which is that the thing we tend to remember from somebody's communication is either the peak moment or the end moment. And it can be different based on what you're looking at. And there's an interesting study behind it, which I won't get into now. But what it basically says is the last thing you end on is actually quite crucially important. And I think your strongest asset as a moderator is not the fact that you're an native English speaker. I think that's something that doesn't differentiate you from others. It's probably that you host these sorts of discussions every single week on your podcast, and there's very few people who will have had that track record of moderating discussions like that. So finding a line, perhaps with a bit of specificity, which is like, P.S. I've moderated over 150 discussions on my podcast already. If you want to get a flavor of what I'm like, listen to this one. It's probably listen to this episode. It's the most popular of all. And that does a couple of things. It ends on a bit of a positive note and a real strength. It also answers what you've just said, which is that you're an English native speaker, because if they are listening to a podcast, they'll figure that out, and maybe provides a bit of a peak end rule. But all of that with a heavy dose of caveat that I'm not an expert at this, in terms of I'm not an expert at your world and moderation, all this stuff. So take all of that with a heavy dose of
No, but
salt.
that being said, I think that is an excellent point. I mean, a lot of these things that you explain with the science behind it are things that we somehow intuitively know but fail to do. Like when you talk about the rule of reciprocity, yeah, you're right. I've heard about that my whole life. And when people do these things to me, sure, I'm more inclined to be helpful in return. I mean, it's obvious, but it's great to be intentional about it and to learn these simple principles so that you can start acting with greater intention in how you operate your business and life.
Yeah.
On that, because you've given these three principles, so would there be any interest in me in this template or this cold message, let's say, to implement more specific things around what you have said? So the distinctiveness, is there a lack of distinctiveness in this?
Well, let me. So I knew you mentioned to me that you're going to share a cold email with me, and I thought, let me share with you the cold email that I sent, and then maybe because that is something I should be an expert at, and I could share with you why I've included certain lines in my cold email, and maybe there can be some cross learning that we can have. So the email I send most often is to authors of books, asking them to come on Nudge and be a guest. This is kind of sometimes easy because authors want to promote their work, but it's also incredibly difficult because these people get endless emails from people like me. So I always have to think about distinctiveness. I always have to think about how I can be different from the standard emails they get. So I start with my subject line, which is name of author, first name. So Alex, the most recent one I sent was to Alex Edmonds, who author of May Contain Lies. I said, Alex, do you want to appear on the UK's #1 podcast? So two things there. First is that bit of anchoring. UK's #1 marketing podcast, I should say. I'm not the UK's #1 podcast. UK's #1 marketing podcast. Bit of anchoring with that. And then the cocktail party effect, which is the idea that people love the sound of their own name. So in a cocktail party, if you're just chatting with somebody who's right in front of you, sipping on your cocktail, and somebody halfway across the room says your name, you will hear your name, even though you haven't been listening to that conversation and you couldn't give any of the context upon which it's been spoken. That's the cocktail party effect. So getting their name in the subject header, I think, helps it stand out. I then say something like, I host Nudge, the UK's #1 marketing podcast, include the source, like we said. I loved your book. And then I have something to make me distinct. Everybody says, I loved your book. And so I put in brackets, many PR folks will tell you this and lie. this is true. Many people will say,
It's true.
oh, I
Yeah.
loved your book, and they never read it. So I've included a picture of my enjoyment. And what I do is I take a picture of me with the book, either the physical copy or the Kindle book. So really prove that I've actually bought it. And it's a picture of my face reading the book. So very, very simple, quite unprofessional, some people might say, but it's something that really helps me stand
Has
out.
anyone ever said that?
Well, that it's unprofessional?
Yeah.
No, they haven't.
Someone could, but then me in my capacity as sort of speaking storytelling coach, I think that works for many other reasons.
Yeah.
Like the connection, the face, so many other aspects that could make that more influential.
Yeah, and a very, there's something nice as an author about literally seeing someone read your book, literally seeing their book in somebody else's hands. So it's a real like non-brainer for me to add in. And pictures are obviously very good at telling stories. I then go on to say I've interviewed many of your peers on Nudge, and sometimes include a bit of an anecdote here about how, I'm missing a persuasion expert. For Alex, he had kind of discredited Simon Sinek and Amy Cuddy in his book. So these are two sort of fellow behavioral science practitioners who were, Amy Cuddy was had a lot of retracted papers. So I put in brackets, I've interviewed many of your peers on Nudge, but I put in brackets, but not Simon Sinek or Amy Cuddy, you'll be happy to hear. So that's just a little bit more evidence, which will make me stand out, which showcases that I've actually read the book. And then I include a bunch of pictures of me talking to people who I know he will know. So me talking to Chris Voss, me talking to Yuri Ganese, me talking to Rory Sutherland, and then in brackets underneath some of the other people I've spoken about. And that just...
Is that the anchoring principle in action? The you with these other people in the field?
Yeah, that's the anchoring principle. It's input bias. It's showcasing the effort that I put into my show. It's sunk costs. It's all of these things. Social proof as well, like literally seeing other people who have been on the show. It just removes a lot of the risk. I then say, to make the most of your time, I'll create 2 episodes and then give the actual title I'm thinking of the episode and the description. Again, this is just, I'm really spending most of this email trying to prove that I've spent a lot of time interested in their emails, trying to do 2 things. 1, suggest that Nudge is a worthwhile place for them to be. And 2, showcase that me as a podcast host has already invested a lot of time in their work. So I've done a lot of that. I've showed that I've invested the time. Now I need to prove to them that Nudge is worthwhile. So I say, Nudge gets over 11,500 listeners per episode and 8,200 people read the newsletter. I publish on YouTube, where I've occasionally reached 300,000 views. And with my combined 30K social media followers, I hope it'll be worth your time, something like that. So this is not new, but it's just trying to provide as much evidence as possible with hyperlinks that this will be a good place for them to share their work.
It's incredibly intentional.
Yeah.
And it is distinct because, you see, I have a lot of pitches for people to come on my podcast. And it's true that I skim read most of it, quite honestly.
Yeah.
And I can feel exactly what you're saying about the PR. And they'll say, I love this last episode. And clearly all they've done is gone onto Spotify, Apple Podcasts, looked at the title description of the last episode, inserted it in. It feels very disingenuous. Of course, as human beings, we notice these things right away. And then I just delete. Delete. Yeah. But what I will say on the flip side, I think it's so fascinating to hear these principles, to illustrate them with a very tangible example. But this is also a risk for you in terms of the time and the investment made. Perhaps you could say at your level, it's going to pay off a lot more than it doesn't. But there is still an element of finding the right balance between time and doing these things.
Yeah, and this is why I've spent so long on this email. This email has to work, because otherwise the model of the podcast starts to break down. Because my model is I read as much as possible, up to around 40 business books a year, which for anyone who reads business books is too many. Get a life. Up to 40 a year with copious notes. And then I'm emailing these authors to try and get them to come on the show. If less than 50% agree to come on, the model breaks down. I will not have enough time to do all the reading. If I don't have enough time to do the reading, I can't get high quality guests. If I can't get high quality guests, I can't make a good show. So it's necessary for this email to be good in order for the show to succeed. And I think there's a bit of a lesson there, which is that you can find specific pieces of communication that you really have to spend a lot of time working on and tweak. We spoke about the header copy. of your website. I think some of your email outreach, which leads to the majority of your revenue, if you find that, whatever that is, go and spend an unparalleled amount of time on those real touch points, which are really, really important. And the rest doesn't have to quite have that much effort associated to it. Don't spend all of your time thinking about the exact right word to put in your LinkedIn post that will go out this afternoon and be read by however many people. That's less important as the email that you will send to a dozen people over the course of the next month.
Yeah. And before we finish up, because you have mentioned this, I think the email subject line is something that is worth investing a little bit of time in, as you have illustrated here with the Alex, do you want to be on the UK's #1 marketing podcast? I recently listened to the masterclass on sales and persuasion by Daniel Pink, who I believe you have interviewed.
Yeah.
And I remember he said, as a standard piece of advice for email subject lines, he said it should either be utility focused, like very specific that someone needs something, or it should be making use of the curiosity gap. So somebody going, man, I need to find out what that is. So for example, let's say I'm targeting this to one of my clients, let's say Nespresso or Nestle, and I want people to be more engaged in the leadership courses I run. I might say, could this training get you a promotion? Knowing that that's what many of them want. They have a very real interest in doing that. And I'm using what Daniel Pink would say is this curiosity gap to get them to open the email.
Yeah.
Do you agree with that? And do you have any last perspectives on this?
Yeah, Dan on my show, I think, shared that exact tip, and we gave the example. There's a fantastic example of I think it's called the best performing email of all time, which was during the 2008 presidential election. It was Barack Obama's. This was when he really nailed digital, the first sort of president to nail digital. It was in 2008. He generated an unparalleled amount of money from online donations at the time. And the email that drove the most donations had the subject line, "Hey," Hey, and that was it. And the reason that was so compelling was because it's like initial and immediate curiosity gap. Oh my God, Obama has just emailed me saying, "Hey." Can you imagine? I have
that takes me back to my like MSN days where I'd be stuck in my chat box, just hey.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. And distinctive by being nostalgic and retro.
Yeah. And just by being Obama. If you're Obama, you can get away with doing that. And I guess that's the point I'd want to end on. And it harps back to one of the initial points we said, which is that all of these principles are fluid. They never apply consistently. You always have to take into account what your audience is experiencing and what you are offering in order to apply them well. And so what I would ask people to do who are listening, if they are thinking about their email subject lines, is to consider curiosity gap, to consider utility, to think about the best thing that they could write, but then to really also consider what are the other emails that their community are receiving, what subject lines do they have? Because where your email subject line would backfire, Shannon, is if everybody was sending a similar email. If everybody sent an email subject line with a question, with a similar with a similar idea, you would not stand out. Your email would not be opened. And yet, if you were to send an email that is just said, "Hey," you perhaps would be opened in that scenario. So consider how you can be distinct within your space. And that, I think, is an important takeaway. There has been a lot of research that suggests that emojis are exactly what you need to get an email to be opened. I could cite a lot of research that says just that. But now everybody uses emojis. That point is invalid. The opposite now is maybe not to use emojis. So find ways to be distinct. And maybe one final point there. You run a newsletter, Shannon. Have a look back at all of the different emails you've sent and all of the different subject lines you've included. Maybe consider that there might be a reason to do something really different for your next one. Do something that stands out, because that actually might increase the amount of opens you have. And you can do that within your own email as well if you send a repeated amount of emails like a newsletter. So that would be my last bit of advice.
Phil, this has been so useful. I'm sure everyone listening will agree. And like I said, if you want to have the breakdown with the text of these principles in action, you can click the link in the show note description, and it will take you to the place where you can download that. I also encourage you to listen to Phil's podcast, Nudge. I don't say it lightly, but it is genuinely so useful, very actionable. Phil, is there any particular episode that you would like to direct the listeners to?
Yeah, well, the episode that should have just come out, perhaps yesterday, on the Nudge podcast feed is called Can You Spot the Invisible Gorilla? And it is about the arguably the most famous study in behavioral science. It's very likely that a lot of your listeners will have taken part in this study and watched it on YouTube. It's a study where you're asked to count the amount of times a basketball is thrown and a gorilla pops across screen, and most people miss it. So it's a study which explains why we miss things that we should otherwise see. And I speak to the researcher behind that study. He explains how it became a bit of a phenomenon, and then explains how it applies to all sorts of aspects of life. And it's interesting because it will help you understand your own psychology, but it'll also help you understand why so many of the people who receive your message don't listen and miss it and don't think about what you're actually trying to say. And by understanding that psychology, you'll understand what you really need to stand out, to resonate.
Phil, thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for your wisdom, your actionable points. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much.